Good afternoon, everybody. I'm told we still have 45 minutes, so we can talk about an important subject, devolution. And as Paul Carter said earlier in his speech, we remember the days when lots more was done by county councils, and we also from Leo, of course, how technology in theory, I think in practice, will actually empower individuals and local communities to actually take matters into their own hands, so to speak, and how we as county councils can fit into that agenda. So, I mean, obviously, the government's had a long-standing commitment to devolution, and we keep hearing from ministers they're very much in favour of it. So there's been quite a lot of activity on that area. We've had mayoral combined authorities, we've had combined authorities, subnational transport boards, regional groupings like Midlands Engine, Northern Powerhouse. All these things have been going on, but I think the one thing they all share in common is they're all structural, and I think we probably need to get beyond the structural and actually talk about genuine devolution. And I've been around long enough to remember Eric Pickles years ago saying, I think he was in opposition then, but what was planned was a single cheque to an area, and then for all services, and then the area would decide how to spend it. I'm afraid we are quite a long way from that at the moment. So, notwithstanding the obvious energy that the government has got into creating these structures, I think that we just need to move that forward. And I think the job for us as county councils is to remind government that actually we are, along with city councils, I think, almost uniquely placed to bring areas together. And my own personal view, you don't need all these structures, just use what you've got. But that, at the moment, it hasn't proved to be an easy ask. And of course, on top of all that, we've got the LEP review going on as well, just to make life a bit more interesting. And obviously the government's currently considering how it's going to, because it keeps telling us this is all bottom up, of course, how we are going to help the LEPs reorganise into more boundaries which don't overlap. So we've got two speakers for you today. First of all, Will Tanner, who's the director of Onward. Will has actually, he came from London by Uber, so that's a very modern way of doing it. And thank you very much, Will, for making the extra effort to get here, because it obviously took quite a bit longer. And he will talk to us. And also Anthony May, who, when he's not Chief Executive of Nottinghamshire County Council, is also very much involved with Midlands Engine and the potential strategic alliance and officers working together to work with government. So without further ado, I'll hand over to them, and obviously we'll have questions first. So Will, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. I'm going to speak from here, if that's okay, and you can all hear me. My name is Will Tanner. I am the director of a new campaigning think tank called Onward, and I'm here today to talk to you about kind of strategic authorities and devolution. Some context for me and kind of my background. I spent 3.5 years or 4 years in government working for the Prime Minister, both as a special advisor in the Home Office and then deputy head of policy in Number 10. And I also had a minor role, a role that I rarely talk about in public, in the manifesto process last year. Indeed. So that's a bit of context for me. And I wanted to say from the outset that I think it's clear, and has been clear for quite a long time, that we need a new political settlement in the UK, a new settlement between central and local government. You all know that problem, you know it firsthand, so I won't dwell too much on it, but I just wanted to say that I think we should recognise that it is both a general problem and a distributional one. We have a general problem in that Britain is one of the most centralised economies in the developed world by the OECD's measure of local tax and spend. We know that in this country many powers are exercised centrally, that in other countries are exercised locally, whether that's economic planning in Germany, whether that's healthcare in Switzerland, whether that's criminal justice in Canada. We know that in this country we tend to do things from the centre, whereas in other countries they make a success of it locally. And I think there is a growing evidence base that we might want to change that. But we also know that that problem is distributional in the sense that Britain has a £4 per worker per hour worked productivity gap between the north and south. We know that London accounts for 22% of GDP despite only comprising 13% of the population, and that London also attracts 50% of affordable housing spend, 50% of R&D spend alongside Oxford and Cambridge. So there's a clear case for rebalancing and there's a clear case for devolving. And we've obviously seen various attempts over the years to do that. 10 years ago, we heard David Cameron pledge radical decentralization. And we have seen efforts from the Northern Powerhouse to the Midlands Engine to devolution deals right across the country. And I think it's fair to say that some of those have been more successful than others. Many of you, I'm sure, will have views on those Devo deals yourselves. But to my mind, they achieved two things. Firstly, they demonstrated to Whitehall, and this is incredibly important, that it's safe to let go in certain circumstances. And I think more than anything, devolution over the last 7 or 8 years has effectively given the green light to the Treasury especially to say that certain things can be done at a local level. And secondly, I think, and this is something we don't talk about very often, they created a competitive tension between local areas that perhaps didn't exist as keenly as before. So when I talk to local areas, I'm often told, why can't we have what Manchester has? Or why is everyone focusing on Birmingham? And actually, I think that's an enormously powerful and good thing that we should seek to build upon, and we should recognise that competition in this sense can be quite powerful, as it is in other countries. But I think we should also be quite clear about where devolution has so far either not succeeded or not gone far enough. So it's completely clear to me, having sat on the inside of government, that devolution has been way too reliant on negotiation with the centre. A lot of this has been made very conditional on meeting very stringent texts that the Treasury and other civil servants have set, rather than starting from a point of empowerment and freedom for local areas. And I think there are lots of ministers within government who completely recognise that, for what it's worth. Secondly, it's been limited to just some places and certain types of place. We've obviously had devolution to metropolitan cities, but what does Devo look like for rural areas? What does Devo look like for suburban areas? At the moment, we have yet to really fully see a vision and a picture set out for those type of deals, and I know that lots of people in this room will have their own views of what those things should look like. To my mind, the next stage of devolution should be more open, more flexible, and just on base principle, much bolder than it's been before. The manifesto talked about a common framework, it talked about consolidating our approach, but it also deliberately did not just talk about mayors. It talked about a framework which I understand the department is delivering, and I think the Secretary of State may have just been talking about, that needs to do a couple of things. It needs to clarify what functions should really sit at which area. I think there is a case for looking in quite a fundamental way at the distribution of responsibilities between central strategic authority, if we can call it that, and a lower level authority within this country. So that might, for example, mean mayors combined and counties, county authorities taking on strategic powers over transport, for example. I think kind of bus franchising and the kind of increasing role around bus and some rail transport could be enormously powerful at local level. We could see, and we've called for this specifically, local or county authorities and combined and mayoral authorities having a greater role in master planning and having potentially call-in powers for larger sites for development. It seems to me that especially for larger sites where there's the possibility of unlocking large amounts of housing, building the proper community infrastructure to go alongside that housing, there is a case for doing that at a higher level than is currently done at a district level. And there is also a case, I think, for going much further on skills and retraining. We've seen a little bit of this so far, but it remains the case that our education and skills system in this country is still run by and large out of DFE, despite the fact that our schools system is almost entirely devolved, and DFE regularly complains that it doesn't have any levers. And it's that the difference between the kind of skills and vocational system and the schools system, I think, is quite a telling one. But it might also mean districts taking on some other powers. So if we're asking districts to give up some powers, then we might also consider whether or not there are certain things that counties currently do, or even that central government currently does, that districts might take on instead. So I'm thinking of things like, for example, libraries. But there might be other things. And then at the same time, I think we need more flexibility for taxes and levies. So, for example, council tax, social care, business rates, we're seeing some flexibility growing there, but if we were to see a truly devolved approach, we might see government really let go and actually let local areas take on far more control, but take on far more accountability for the decisions they make. And at the moment, we have a slightly halfway house where government gives some flexibility, but caps that in different ways. And I think as we move kind of forward, I would urge the government to be slightly more flexible in that regard. But if we're going to change around these powers and potentially devolve things down to a more local level, I'd be quite keen to see us place, or be quite conscious of the conditions that we might expect for certain places to take on those responsibilities. It's clear that local areas need to have good financial management if they're going to start taking on increasingly complex strategic powers, and I think we should be honest, especially the people in this room, should be honest about the ways in which counties might need to improve in certain respects to deliver that, and to give the confidence to central government that they can devolve. As I say, I think we've already seen some proof with metros that we can do this. It seems to me entirely plausible that counties can too. Secondly, I think a degree of political leadership and stability will be really important. We've seen a number of areas, especially around the unitary process, find that quite difficult in different ways. And so demonstrating to central government that there is a degree of kind of political coherence around devolution will be important. And lastly, support and involvement from the local business community. I know that at local level, there is often very strong links between local authorities and local business, and obviously LEPs have, in some parts of the country, successfully brought business into the kind of structures of local government, in some areas not as successfully. But I do think we need to think about how strategic authorities can leverage and forge very close links between their functions and the business community. So that's a bit of a quick run through where I see the lay of the land. You've just heard the Secretary of State give, I think, a quite vague indication of when the devolution framework will be coming out. I think, for what it's worth, I think there's a huge amount of opportunity to influence that process still. I think, as we were just discussing on the panel, actually, the political volatility at the moment is making it relatively difficult for government to think about the wider policy piece, which obviously comes with challenges, but it also creates an enormous vacuum for which other people can fill, and there are people in this room who will have great ideas with which to fill it. So I would urge you not just to talk amongst yourselves, but to actively take your ideas to Westminster. That's specifically what Onward is all about. We want to generate the next generation of ideas to sustain kind of mainstream political life in this country, and I would be delighted to work with anyone in this room to help bring some of those ideas to a national stage. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Will. Good afternoon, colleagues. My name's Anthony May, and I'm the Chief Executive of the County Council in Nottinghamshire. But as Martin said by way of introduction, in the last 4 years I've been involved in 4 various elements of what could be broadly described as the devolution agenda. I was heavily involved in a failed devolution bid between all councils in Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire. I'm currently involved in the ambition of the 7 upper tier councils across the East Midlands to form a strategic alliance. I'm very heavily involved in Sir John Peace's Midlands Engine, and Nottinghamshire County Council is currently involved in exploring options for unitary status for our county. I'm going to give some reflections on all of those things and how I think they relate to the broader agenda of devolution, but particularly I think I'm going to conclude by saying that The time is right for county councils to seize the day and demonstrate more leadership in respect of both devolution but also the future form and function of local government and its relationship both downwards with local people and upwards with central government. And everything we've heard today from the speakers that have gone before me has reinforced my view that the time is right for us to step forward. And I'll explore why I think that in a few moments. But I'm going to start with giving you the Oxford Dictionary definition of strategic, just so that we can root this conversation in something that's tangible to all of us. The dictionary says that strategic relates to the identification of long-term or overall aims and the interests and the means of achieving them. My view as local government leaders, whether we're paid as officers or whether we're elected, our job is to think about the future. My experience of some of the devolution arrangements that I've been involved in is that they think too much about the present. The devolution deal that we were involved in Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire was really quite an ambitious deal. It did include an elected mayor, and I think we got caught up in the present politics and real politics of the time. And we did experience that tension that Will described between negotiating with government when 99% of the time the answer is no, because the civil service and government hasn't got used yet to living the rhetoric of devolution. And if we are going to seize the day as county councils, we need a much more meaningful dialogue with government about what it means to let go and give away powers and influence that they've had for literally decades, if not centuries. It's not an easy thing culturally for them to do. My view as counties, and if you look at the map behind me, just look at the landmass of this country that counties cover. There's a great opportunity for government, never mind their slender majority, to work with us in a win-win bargain around the next steps for devolution. If I think about how difficult it is currently in Nottinghamshire to be negotiating change in our structure with a group of district councils who understandably find that a difficult conversation, and I reflect against the difficulty that government has in taking a lead in the future structure for local government, it leads me to the conclusion that as a group of county councils we have to make the running, do more work on what good could look like. The truth is we're drowning under a whole host of social and financial change, the like of which was described to us this morning by Leo Johnson, but we don't know what the future looks like yet, but we can plan for it. My definition of strategic includes planning for the future. As a group of county councils, I think we're extremely well placed to forecast the future, whether it's the enormous opportunities that technology bring or just because we know what local people think and what they want. I guarantee what they don't want is infighting between various sectors of local government or disjoint between local government and central government. And I think county councils can be a unifying force in that. I wonder sometimes what problem we're trying to solve when we talk about strategic authorities. If our locus as county councils is to provide statutory and non-statutory service on a grand scale, on a spatial scale, and by and large, as the Secretary of State says, we're really good at it, why don't we get the confidence as a sector to say how good we are and begin a new negotiation with government post-Brexit, when with the spending review and a post-Brexit economy to worry about and a green paper for health and social care, they need answers and a fruitful dialogue as much as we do and as much as our local people do. Where I've seen this work well, for example, in the regional powerhouse that I'm involved in, it's because that relationship between the powerhouse and government works and it's non-threatening. I wonder how we can develop a dialogue with government about devolution, which says, for sure, we need the powers and resources so that our local people can thrive, and it would help if you decluttered the system, because there is no doubt if we had a blank sheet of paper, we wouldn't start here. But at the same time, we're not avaricious. We want to do it at your pace. We want to understand your needs. And I wonder whether we do that enough. I think we have a sympathetic Secretary of State. He's the Midlands Engine champion. He's very conscientious. He's very sincere in his views, but of course he's got constraints. I think we've got an opportunity, particularly through the Brexit period and in a negotiation about rates retention, fair funding, adult social care and health green paper, whatever opportunities are at hand to use those as vehicles for a different kind of relationship with government, one where we're very honest about what we want. And not from a reductionist perspective. Everybody knows we've had 8 or 9 years of austerity and it's difficult and we're making tough decisions, but what are the opportunities for the future? I made a list of them this morning when I was preparing for this. Aside from the things I've already said and the things we've heard about in respect of the advent of new technology and the way that people are living and the impact of algorithms and a global economy, and releasing the creativity of our young people, there's some straightforward public service vehicles that I think we can exploit better. We should continue to make representation about what works for us in our LEP reviews. We should continue to press government for a simplified devolution framework where they are happier to give away power and control that they've had for a very long time. My view, having had the experience of devolution deals, a regional growth engine, local unitary bid, and all of those things that are manifest of the tension in the system, is it's actually easier to ask government to let go than it is, say, our district and borough council colleagues or other agencies locally who don't feel they've got the same status and clout that we have. That just creates unnatural and unnecessary tensions, notwithstanding the fact that, in my view, government should show more leadership in respect to the future shape of local government, because to say it should be enabling and bottom up, it's okay for now, probably. But I wonder whether, notwithstanding the current financial problems we've got and the issues around Brexit, which, as Leo Johnson said, is just in some way a totem of what's going on in the world, it will be enough for the next 10, 15 or 20 years, by which time many of us in this room will be gone, but I'd hate to think we're still left with the current messy structures that we've got and the current, by and large, difficult relationship with local partners that creates. So I believe there are many opportunities, but I think in order to exploit them, we've got to ask some fundamental questions. So the first question is about step change. If we're on the cusp of a 21st century society which is totally different than the one that we grew up in, what do we need to do as public service leaders to be fit for that? What step change do we need to take, and how is that best negotiated? Is it best negotiated locally, laterally? So I think there are some really good examples of bilateral performance improvements between my organisation and others. Where it falls down is when we try and get together and identify shared priorities. So if the best way we could exploit what looks to me like a completely different way of living, working, educating ourselves, and make the best of what looks to me like enormous advances in technology, I think it should be incumbent on us to decide what our priorities are as a group of county councils. Absolutely, I agree that they need to be negotiated locally when we get to the point of implementation, but let's manage that relationship upwards and try and influence the devolution framework. So it sets out what powers, what influences, what levers of change we need locally. And if we are going to begin a new relationship with central government based on that, let's make it one that suits their terms as well, because it looks to me that the majority is not going to get bigger anytime soon. The tensions around Brexit are not going to be resolved anytime soon. That's going to be a decade-long discourse in public service. So my view is it's probably in our interest to take the long-term view of this as well, and maybe take some small steps which will eventually enable us to get further towards that step change. Thank you very much.
If we could have the lights down, please. I can't see anybody out there. Could I just start? We've got about 10 minutes, I think, for questions. Could I just start? I mean, obviously, earlier we talked about technology, how actually in 10 years' time, how we interact with our residents and how we do business ourselves will change totally. And I think coming back to Anthony's point about thinking of the future, part of the devolution agenda, how do you see we can actually make the arguments and capture that argument to say things are going to change and we need to be in the right space? So do you want to start, Will?
Yes, I mean, technology proposes or kind of gives a huge opportunity, but it also creates a huge challenge. And I think we often focus on how we can best exploit new technologies, but there's a kind of there is a secondary question about what do we do with the people who aren't brought up with technology, because actually I think a lot of those people will be the people reliant on your services. Technology can perhaps make you more efficient, it can perhaps create new relationships between you and your constituents, but it will also create barriers to entry for certain people if you go entirely online. So I would hesitate between kind of running kind of headlong into a new world where everything is digitized, because there are, as you know, lots of people who are not yet caught by that great wave. But I think just the thing that I think most keenly about technology is that the thing it does is change the relationship between the service provider and the user. It creates an opportunity for something that's far more responsive, far more transparent, far more kind of easy to use for ordinary people if it's done right. So you mentioned today that I got an Uber here from London, and the prospect of I mean, whatever you think about Uber's practices, but the prospect of safe, easy to use, transparent transport with a rating for a driver and a kind of cost-effective price point, I think is something that you could transpose quite keenly into local government across a whole range of different services, with quite powerful results, actually, potentially improving people's trust in the service, potentially improving responsiveness to vulnerable people. There are a whole range of different opportunities I think that local government could exploit.
Thank you. I mean, obviously, Anthony, but the issue is how can government keep on being so centralised in this new technological age? If you've got a view.
So technology generally starts with innovation. Innovation is often local to our universities, our further education colleges. I think we've got a key relationship with those, which I would suggest colleagues ought to foster. However, from innovation to commercialising technology, I think that's a much broader question, and a question where government has a leading role. To translate that into changes in public service delivery, I think has to be a partnership between the large providers. The leader of the council and I, Kay Cutts, attended a futurologist session last week where a guy was trying to paint a picture of 2030. What would our society look like? What would public service look like in 2030? He said two things that struck me about the relationship between local authorities, innovators, and the big tech giants. First of all, he said, if you're not moving your services to the cloud to enable digital transformation, you really should be. They're safer, they're better, they future-proof you. And secondly, he said, particularly in terms of the development of place, if you're not in a relationship with the local tech providers, the big ones, Google, Amazon, whoever they might be, then you ought to be, because they have a lot of power and a lot of resource, and they know that this change in the way people live is coming, whether it's the relationship between a service provider and an older person or a young person with special educational needs. They can see a market opportunity there. So I like the idea of a digital declaration from James and central government, but I think we need to make the run-in locally, particularly with our universities and the tech companies.
Thank you. Right, questions then from the floor. Yes, I have a gentleman there. Thank you. We're in microphones still, I assume. The dreaded box has gone forever, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Richard Smith. I'm the Cabinet Member for Finance at Suffolk County Council, and I want to treat you as the panel as a kind of a psychiatrist today, because I think I need your advice. I think I need to lay down on a bed and listen to what you advise me, because I'm a very firm believer in unitary government in Suffolk. We have 7 district councils, and our relationship with those 7 district councils, which will actually be 5 after May, because in East Suffolk and in West Suffolk, both cases 2 districts combining. And they don't really like us. They don't really get on as well with us as I would like. And so whenever we mention this to them, we get a very cold reception. That's why I need your advice. I'm very intrigued that we may have some luck if we go up to central government rather than down. But I feel I need to lie down in a dark room and listen very carefully to what you may advise me.
Thank you, Anthony. You've got vast experience on these sort of issues.
Yes, so I'm really worried now. You might, you might be relying on me for psychiatrist's advice. I think what I was trying to say in my presentation was I've worked with district councils. 36 years now I've been in local government. I've only ever worked in large county councils, so self-evidently two-tier. Bilateral arrangements, bilateral programs and projects of activity have always been, in my view, extremely productive. What doesn't work necessarily as well is when you bring all of those components together and try and set a vision for the future of your local area. My experience is when you try and do that, say, in our devolution deal, albeit that it failed in the end, it was still visionary through the Midlands Engine for Growth. In other words, managing either across with your peers or upwards to government, the results are better. It's just, for me, the evidence suggests the outcomes are much better. I'm not saying you shouldn't try and sustain the two-tier system while it's currently in place, although, of course, it's a local political choice to challenge it and say it could be done better. I happen to believe that the role of central government is to show more leadership in that space, but it doesn't seem we're going to get that anytime soon. I think I'm saying, look at your alternatives. That's the reason we came to the conclusion in East Midlands that we'd like to develop a strategic alliance between the upper tier councils to persuade government to give us a different kind of devolution deal, one where you don't need a mayor. You might not get the same powers and influence that, say, Andy Street gets, but you'll get more than you've got now. It doesn't exclude the districts because we've got the East Midlands councils where the districts turn up and they play a full and fulfilling part. It just recognises that upper tier councils have got a lot of power and they reach literally hundreds of thousands of people every day.
Thank you. I've got two more questions. I've got the back there, gentleman at the back with his hand up, and then there's Ian just there somewhere. Thank you.
Yeah, Cornelius Olivier from Cornwall Council, representing Penzance. You talked about tax-raising powers, right? Now, and we're in the ridiculous position at the moment that if you're a member of a town council in Cornwall, you can take over your local library from Cornwall Council and you can stick up your precept by 80% or £1 a week, to put it another way, and take over that library. Whereas Cornwall Council cannot stick up its precept by 8% to deal with adult social care. So devolution, which has progressed a long way in Cornwall because the authorities there are coterminous, LEP, Health Authority, Cornwall Council are all coterminous in their boundaries. We've progressed a long way. But how much does it mean without autonomy when it comes to tax-raising powers? But my question is that, once you bring in councils having control over setting business rates or council tax, you face the facts that some councils cover poorer areas than others. So say the government restored autonomy...
I'm going to cut you short. I think we got the drift. Yeah, okay.
How would you...
Will, would you like to answer
that? Than that guy. Come on, right. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
So I think with the caps on various local levies and taxes, I think you need to go back to the original rationale for the government putting it in place, which was essentially to try and ensure that they never had a position where local taxes were being put up to compensate for central government cuts in different ways, and that it was a political decision essentially to try and prevent local areas for making political statements using local taxes. We're now in a position where actually public spending, as per the spending review next year, is likely to start rising in real terms across the board, I would expect. And so some of the political need for caps diminishes, I think, over time, and there is an opportunity for the government to show political leadership and at least give more flexibility around the precept and council tax, or potentially to give complete flexibility over time. We might see that in a kind of graduated way. You're right that some areas are poorer than others and that there's a unequal distribution of funding already between local areas that people might want to compensate locally. I worked in the Home Office for a long time, and Surrey Police has long done that with their local precept, which is the highest in the country by far compared to other areas, and local people seem to be pretty happy with that. So, I mean, personally, I agree with you. I think local areas should have far more control, but it needs to be done in a way that's politically saleable for the government at the time. And I think right now the government well, I think there is more a case for doing it now than ever before, certainly under the Conservatives, and it will just require, I think, local authorities making the case repeatedly for graduated improvements in their own flexibility. I don't think the cap's going to be lifted entirely anytime soon, but personally, I think there is a case for increasing much more flexibility.
Thank you. Now, final question. Thank you, Ian.
Ian Hudsworth, Oxfordshire. I think everybody knows my views on reorganisation, but the thing is there a different way of working? And actually the answer is yes, because we could still carry on fighting in Oxfordshire, or alternatively, actually get together with districts. We're working well, we've got the growth deal, £215 million, down payment, HIF funding, and more importantly, we've got evidence of joint working sitting beside me, because the chief executive is shared with the district council. We're now going to move on trading standards and environmental services shared. We're looking at health and housing, seeing how we can incorporate that, and sharing, which is all we're talking about the same client. It's not just about cost savings, it's about delivering better services. And now actually what's happening is the other districts are looking and sort of saying, well, how come Cherwell are getting everything? Because we're working together, and that's the key answer to it. So I might suggest to everybody, try working with your districts. I'm not saying the long-term solution will be any different, but you get good feedback in the meantime.
Anthony, I mean, I think that's a sensible way in the world we're in at the moment.
Yes, I think there's the politics of this and there's the realpolitik. Whatever works for you locally, it's conditional. In some places, joint working with the districts, I'm sure, is extremely successful. In others, I think it's more challenging. I wouldn't let that deflect from working with government for a longer-term vision for local government, which is simpler and flatter and more accessible and more cost-efficient. But if that works for you locally and clearly you can describe the benefits, then more power to your elbow. It doesn't work everywhere.
Will.
So I agree with what's just been said and with the comments in your question. I think the kind of greatest lesson for everyone in this room, I would say, is don't apologise, or don't ask permission, apologise afterwards. Just get on with it. I mean, bluntly, the government is so distracted by everything else going on at the moment that they may not even notice for quite a while. Seriously, there is enormous opportunity for innovation at the moment, partly because of political difficulty, partly because of the flexibilities you already have, and partly because I think you've got a government and a Secretary of State who genuinely does believe in devolution. So if you don't have the powers, ask for them. There are lots of people in Westminster arguing that now is the time for a great devolution settlement once more, and I hope we get it.
Thank you. Our time is up, so apologies for those people who wanted to speak and couldn't. So just falls upon me to thank Will and Anthony for coming, giving us their time and their knowledge, and just we'd like to thank them in the usual way. Thank you.